welcome to this month's edition of Slugger TV. In this episode, we're looking at the future of North Belfast. We're here at the Ulster University Belfast campus, right in the heart of this wonderful constituency. And to go through this absolutely critical topic, because we all love North Belfast, we have Alliance MLA Nuala McAllister, we have the DUP MLA Phillip Brett, and we have the Belfast Telegraph crime and security correspondent Allison Morris. You're very, very, very welcome. And also a new addition, by the way, we've got an audience with us here today for only the third time ever in Slugger TV's history. So I'm going to start off with a question to you, Nuala. You're newly elected to MLA level. I know you've been about North Belfast since 2014. When we talk about a vision for North Belfast, I mean, what's yours in terms of the Alliance Party's vision and that for North Belfast?
So the vision that I have for North Belfast is one that I've had since I was elected in 2014, first as a councillor, and then when I was Lord Mayor of Belfast in 2017 as well. And it's in North Belfast, an entirety of Belfast as an open, welcoming and most importantly an inclusive place. So obviously representing Alliance Party, I'm obviously going to talk about cross-community activity and the fact that we are just one community that happen to live in a place that has divided lines, and sometimes we can also get caught up in the way of conversations of whether it's divided conversations that can often lead to negative politics. But for me, I want to see a North Belfast that is just one community. Just for one example that I always think about that really kind of not gets me down about our area, that kind of keeps me going about wanting to change North Belfast, is the fact that we have a peace wall that runs through one of our parks. You know, I recently had people come over to visit from Paris who had been to visit in Berlin. And obviously we know that the Berlin Wall that came down after '89, and whenever they saw the wall in the Alexandra Park area, it just beggared belief for them. They just could not comprehend that we had a peace wall that ran through the middle of our park. Now, we have had a lot of progress, but we must remember that more peace walls went up after the Good Friday Agreement than ever existed before it. So just because we have had progress doesn't mean that we need to stop now, because more and more people have come into North Belfast, have chosen to stay in North Belfast too. People like myself and Phil. And Phil and I, actually, we grew up together and we both represent completely different political parties as well. But we grew up together, we hung about together, we talk about North Belfast together because we see it as a place that is a thriving community. And it's one thing that I want to see is that more inclusive element, the ability for communities to come together on a daily basis across the divide and really see that thriving society, thriving economy, see more and more businesses come. And we are seeing that, whether it's in the Cave Hill area, whether it's in the Shore Road area, we're seeing more and more businesses that are wanting to open up, more people that are wanting to stay, and more families calling it home. Okay.
And Phillip as well, you're not so newbie. I know it's you were first elected to the Assembly earlier last year actually, but you've been a councillor in the area for a long time. What about you? What for the DUP is the vision for the constituency?
David, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for delaying it and allowing us to see Ireland win in the rugby today. For me, David, and my election campaign was based upon one slogan, and that was "No community left behind." As Nuala said, the North Belfast that her and I grew up in is a very different place in many parts, and has changed for the better. But not all communities in North Belfast have felt the benefit of that change. And for me, that means that every part of North Belfast and every person who lives in it should have access to affordable and suitable housing. That means regardless of where our young people are growing up in North Belfast, they have access to the best possible schools. It means regardless if you live on the Antrim Road, the Shore Road, or anywhere in between, that you have access to the healthcare that you need. And that means that no community feels as if there's a part of them that's been left behind while other parts are regenerated. So for me, my ambition was that all parts of North Belfast felt the benefits that other parts have felt, and that's what I've been committed to doing. It's trying to empower our communities to get that confidence that they can take the next step forward. And as Nuala rightly says, we do want to see, peace walls removed, and we want to see our communities coming together. But in order to do that, it needs to be community-led. It's not for me, or it's not for anyone else to tell our people who live in those communities how they need to live or what happens in their area. We need to give them the confidence to be able to say, yes, we're ready to take that next step forward. So for me, it's about ensuring that all of North Belfast benefits from the new process that we're in, but that the people ultimately have the confidence to be able to benefit from that.
Right. Alison, you used to write for the North Belfast News. You covered some of the more grueling bits in North Belfast history. Where for you, do you think, the journey North Belfast has travelled? Because we were often ground zero. I know you're from West Belfast as well, but North Belfast, along with West Belfast,
obviously the best part of Belfast.
was obviously ground zero, often in many of the disputes that we saw in the division that Nuala and Phillip have alluded to. Where do you think we've come since then?
It's interesting because whenever I started working as a journalist at that stage, it was like, just after the Good Friday Agreement. So, talking like 1999, and at that stage, already in West Belfast where I was living, and I had, very young children, you could start to see the peace dividends. You could start to see it been off. There was investment. There was, big shopping centres being built. There was an optimism and a feeling of optimism in the air. But I spent far, far, far too much of my time standing at interfaces in North Belfast, because at that stage, well, I went straight into the Holy Cross dispute in 2001, and that did not happen in isolation. Anyone who lived around there will know that whole area, every single night there was riots at those interfaces, there was people under siege, there was people living in terrible conditions. And I remember spending a night with one of the families at the interface, and the next morning, as the sun was coming up, driving across, the West Circular to West Belfast to put my own children to school, and thinking, that was like night and day, and it was like the Belfast of my childhood, as if it had never changed. Because while it wasn't easy, let's face it, to get the peace process, but solving that I suppose that war in terms of between republicanism and the British government, and what came about with those Humes-Adams talks, that didn't settle the sectarian conflict. It still existed in those really interfaith communities. That went on for many years afterwards. So in terms of that, the last time I covered all of those 12 disputes, all of that. My season used to start with a tour of the North and end with the last Saturday parade in September, and I would have been to riots, once a week all the way through that.
You got hit with a ladder at one, didn't you?
Well, somebody threw a ladder at me and I ducked and hit Deborah McAllister in the head instead, but they did say hit her with it, which was me, and I do have a scar in my mouth for when somebody hit me with a. Well, they weren't trying to hit me, they were trying to hit a cop, and I foolishly stood in the wrong position and I got hit with it instead. But yes, you try to dodge missiles at rats, not always successfully. But now I remember, and you remember because I was actually with you, 12th of July, finishing work at about, I think it was about 6 or 7 o'clock, and walking around and sitting and having a drink. We sat in Murals and watched the end of the parade going past, and I thought, did I ever think, even last year, the year before that I would be home at a reasonable hour and not having to stand and watch that? And you can see how things have changed, and they changed quite dramatically in quite a short period of time. But I will say, as a journalist, when I'm dealing with stories in North Belfast, the one thing that is the real major problem, and I think it's probably is what you said, housing. The housing situation is chronic, and again, I remember doing a feature on housing, and a guy took me around all of these people who were in housing stress. So they had houses, but completely unsuitable houses. I mean houses, with basically full organisms, growing up the wall, mould everywhere. Children living in terrible conditions who are constantly sick from the state of it. And then there needs to be, if you're trying to grow a community, you need not just social housing, but you need affordable housing, and you also need the infrastructure that goes along with that. Don't just build big housing estates, like build places that are communities, and that would make such a difference, because it's the one thing now we've managed to get away from those parading disputes, and for North Belfast to be, the centre of all that trouble every summer, which nobody wanted, and now that it isn't, you still have people living in such, I think that people think when someone's, on a homeless list or a housing stress list, but these are people who actually have houses, but houses that should have been knocked down long ago, flats that should have been knocked down long ago and replaced with better housing. So, I don't need your votes. I get paid whether somebody likes me or not. I know, like you say. But the one thing that strikes me when I go out and report, because I do crime and security, so I'm not in the nice, leafy, lovely places up at, past the shops at the top of the Antrim Road. I'm usually, in places in other communities where there is conflict or trouble. And that's the one thing that always distresses me, that people are living in conditions that should have been fixed a long time ago.
You see, yeah, so we've spoken there a wee bit about North Belfast being polarised, and Nuala, you've talked a wee bit about, obviously some of the peace walls we've got. But I was interested to know, I didn't know that you two kind of knew each other before politics.
I used to beat him up. I'm only joking. I'm only joking. But just verbally.
But how much political cooperation is there? I mean, the DUP and Alliance and Sinn Féin, would you, or the SDLP or all the other parties, would you guys work together on problems? I mean, is there a lot of cooperation?
Okay, so I'll give you the positives and the negatives. I'm going to be brutally
go ahead.
Brutally honest, okay, because I imagine that's what people want to hear. So in council, when I first entered Belfast City Council, I saw for the first time just how divided it was internally in North Belfast, to be perfectly honest. It got to a point, as an example, where, you know, I saw West Belfast, South Belfast, East Belfast having the partnership boards. North Belfast, it folded, didn't have it anymore. And I thought in the back of my head, is that because there wasn't very much partnership working that was going on? And, you know, whilst it wasn't all because of that, you know, there were difficulties around that. But when it came to funding, and mostly politically driven funding, it is very much still a carve up at times, particularly council-led funding. That was essentially, and it's all public, you know, I'm not afraid to say it, is when we had funding such as the Belfast Investment Fund, the Local Investment Fund. You know, one of the examples was in North Belfast, East Belfast, South, the area working groups got the number of funding for each area, dependent on areas of multiple deprivation, you know, calculations, how the maths works. And every other area was strategic, except North. And to my surprise, I found that the money was divided by the amount of councillors, and each councillor got to decide where that money would go on local investment. And I just could not believe that this was the case. I just thought that surely can't be right. And, you know, it's not like that anymore. And, you know, it's now an open call and it's a transparent process, and parties have, you know, thought we need to, you know, recognise and move on. But that was only 2014 until 2019. And now it was more of an open call process. But that to me just really spoke volumes about how if we can't work together and make our priorities known for each area, then we are still divided in North Belfast. But then we cooperate in a lot of other areas too. So there is a recognition that there is severe need, particularly when it comes to health inequalities in our more working class communities in North Belfast. And there isn't a single councillor or MLA from any political party that won't work together to address those health inequalities for sure. But we do still have pockets of area where we will see money go to a certain area and a different area, rather than, you know, money coming together to strategise on what could be a bigger area. And I know that other parties might not agree, but I just fundamentally don't think that that's right for society, that we should do it on a priority based strategic way of thinking. Now, of course, we still will have communities in North Belfast that are different from one another, and, you know, and we are very reflective in that, and we have to respect that each person has their own tradition and culture, and should be allowed to celebrate. But we should also be able to celebrate and integrate at the same time. So we can cooperate, but we don't have at times the best ways of doing so.
Okay. Philip, what about you again? Political cooperation in North Belfast, do we see much of it? And I know you worked for Nigel Dodds before that's an MP, so even at that level, did you see much cooperation between parties?
Probably come at this at a slightly different angle, David, in that my political career began at the periphery of North Belfast in Antrim and Newton Abbey Council, where 96% of all decisions were made unanimously by all political parties. We didn't have to go into Belfast City Council chamber and everyone get up and try and argue as much as they could so they could get a clip for Twitter and say how amazing they are standing up for the people that they represent. So I had a wonderful working relationship with all the parties. I represented Glengormley, 7 councillors, all the political parties represented. They're all from DUP, UUP, STLP, Sinn Féin and Alliance all had representation. So we worked together on those issues. The Alliance group leader and I in Antrim and Newton Abbey worked very, very well together, as I say, with all political parties. So when I then got elected to the Assembly, I thought that it would be exactly the same as that. So there are issues of definite cooperation, as Nuala says, in terms of, you know, trying to attract investment into North Belfast, trying to push forward our investment for our health services, etc. Recently I was with Conor Maskey, hopefully that doesn't lose many votes by saying this, securing funding for a shared football pitch on the Shore Road. There's £1 million of investment. So there is definitely working relationships there, but I suppose inner North Belfast is seen as a lot more polarised than the external parts of North Belfast. For a lot of people, they don't realise that, you know, up into White Abbeys in North Belfast, Glengormley's in North Belfast, people just think North Belfast is a very small piece of the Antrim Road and Shore Road, when in fact actually it's one of the biggest constituencies in Northern Ireland. So it's a very diverse constituency. It's geographically big, and in some places there's better cooperation than others. But Nuala and I certainly haven't had an argument since we've both been elected. But in terms of, you know, Nuala's priorities and my priorities for North Belfast, I imagine are 99% the same. We just see different ways in which we may want to achieve those.
But why does it always seem, because obviously at election times it seems to be one of the more polarised contests, so why is it around, I mean, it was really interesting this time because obviously we're watching to see whether Alliance would make again, but the DP and Sinn Féin as well. I mean, it seems to be a pretty, like 2019 it was a very hotly contested Westminster seat. It was Nigel Dodds, John Finucane and yourself, Nuala. So why is that?
I think, I mean, it was very, I think, polarised between Sinn Féin and DUP, because there was obviously a big fight as to who was going to take that Westminster seat. And as you can see, whenever Sinn Féin over the years were creeping up on the DUP in the Westminster seat, it was quite obvious that was going to happen. And look, that's, at the end of the day, it's also politics and politicians who represent the parties in which they represent, and each party has different views of others. But I, you know, whenever I put myself forward for the Westminster election, Alliance ran, and Sinn Féin and DP, only 3 parties. You know, there weren't many constituencies where that actually happened across Northern Ireland. So of course it was going to be hotly contested, because it was the one to watch, and then Nigel Dodds lost his seat and John Finucane won, and that's because it was, I think, quite significant, because certain political parties obviously made it their constituency, their focus. For us, we were same right across the board, that we had to absolutely progress the same message, whether you were in North Belfast, North Down, Fermanagh, South Tyrone, or whether you were anywhere else in Northern Ireland, that the message for us in Alliance was always the same.
Okay. Alison, North Belfast is a constituency that we always watch out for at election times, but also we talk about kind of some of the polarised debates, and it is one of the more interesting ones. What have you seen actually in terms of the tenor of kind of political debate here? I mean, did anything Phillip or Nuala say shock you about the cooperation that goes on under the radar?
No, that's been going on, I mean, for a long time, right back as far as I was covering the councils over 20 years ago. You know, you'd had politicians who would have come out and been mortal enemies in public, and then they'd have, you know, went away and council funded junkets on the piss together, you know, like, and there wouldn't have been a bad word said, you know. So there's always been that, has always took place. And they do work at times quite well together, but you know, that I suppose that's sort of bare bait, and a lot of that is just done for publicity and publicity's sake. That 2019 election I thought was horrendous, in terms of, I mean, John Finucane is clearly someone who suffered a lot during the Troubles. You know, he watched his father being murdered. Nigel Dodds is also, you know, a victim of the Troubles and survived an attack on his life. And yet with these banners going up with, you know, dripping in blood all over the place, you know, with John Finucane's name on it, it got really bad. And eventually, you know, when it comes to time, I wonder, will there ever be a time that we will realise that that kind of negative electioneering, it does get your vote out, there's no doubt about it, gets your vote out, but it also makes the other side get their vote out too, because the anger then builds. So it's completely counterproductive, and at some point someone has to realise that this is not the way to run an election. You know, constantly, you know, attacking your, not just your opponent, but your opponent's family and everything belonging to them, and getting that sort of down into the mud, dirty and personal, it might well attract you a sort of hardline element and get them out to vote, but it'll do exactly the same thing on the other side, and so it won't cause a blind bit of difference at the end of the day. And you know, I would like that at one time, I like to think that we will all live in a lovely utopia where our elections will be based on policies and not on the, you know, the head count that we have at the minute. But the fact is, we are a divided society, and also, you know, there's people have very, the debate that we have now, I think, is very different, because there's now a debate over the future of the entire island. We're not talking about an election to Westminster, an election to the Assembly, an election to the Council. There's also people looking forward as to what this island will look like in 20 or 30 years' time, and we have two very different traditions who want something completely different. So you're always going to have that in elections right up until God knows whatever that constitutional issue is resolved or not.
We also had that election in the context of Brexit as well, and the Brexit debate really polarised people here. It was really unfortunate to see that the Brexit really did, and that's the truth of it. It polarised people. You know, there were those who wished to remain within the EU and those who didn't, and you know, who would have thought that? Well, many of us did, but you know, would we have thought that in 2016 that we'd still be here with not everything sorted? Still is polarised over this, like the question of Brexit, whether we like it or not. And I did not like how the result came about. That it's still not finished, it's still not fixed. We have so many more issues with it, and when you have an election straight after that, and specifically a general election where, you know, the STV elections are really good. They're really helpful for people to actually have choice in that if I can't have the person that best suits my views, and let's have the next person. But when it's first past the post, it's all or nothing, and that's dangerous at times too. And when you have the context of Brexit, just everything was kind of just simmering in the background too, and it wasn't pleasant to be part of as well. You know, elections are very hard on people, and seeing that, and we had similar situations. We had it in North Down when Alliance took the win there in 2019. We had, you know, banners and things going up about Stephen Farry too. We've had it in East Belfast before. It is difficult, but it just seemed at that time that there was almost like the perfect storm in the background just to create it, and it is rather unfortunate. Yeah.
Nuala's referenced Brexit. Obviously, North Belfast was literally nearly split down the middle. It narrowly went Remain by like 0.6%. Phil, what about in terms of what Nuala and what Alison have said there? Obviously, this has provoked a debate. You are the Brexiteer on the panel. So, what? Give us the pro-Brexit take on that.
Well, I'll go back to the first point in relation to just, you know, why North Belfast this time, you know, or the last general election was always one to watch. You know, North Belfast has always been a constituency that the media have been interested in. 2001, when Nigel Dodds won the seat first of all from Cecil Walker, that was one of the first indications that the DUP were overtaking the Ulster Unionists in unionism. It's always been a constituency that has returned you know, 3 unionists, 3 nationalists. We then had the reduction in seats, and then we had Nuala being elected as the first non-designated MLA. So we've seen changes in North Belfast, but we continue to see the focus of the media there because there's always big profile, big beast candidates. You know, John Finucane was an excellent candidate for Sinn Féin. Nigel Dodds had been the long-established deputy leader of the DUP. So it was always a constituency that was going to attract a lot of focus. As you say, David, North Belfast in the referendum split nearly down the middle in terms of probably was 52-48, I think, something like that for Remain. But as Nuala says, the process isn't quite finished. We are in ongoing discussions continuously on this issue, but let's hope that we get a resolution very soon that can command that cross-community support so Nuala and I can get back to work as a trouble.
I actually got a flashback when you said Cecil Walker of working in the North Belfast. I forgot that man existed. Now that was a character. Yes. Politics doesn't particularly have those kind of characters anymore.
I remember Cecil Walker. I'm old enough to remember him as the MP.
He was interesting to deal with, yeah.
As the MP. By the way, you may be wondering where Sinn Féin are. We did invite John Finucane along. He had to withdraw from the panel. We did ask for another Sinn Féin representative, but we couldn't get one to come along. So we got. Why me? So we traded up, and so we traded up, and we got Alison to come along for us. By the way, just to explain that, you may be wondering, that's not John Finucane. We're talking about North Belfast having challenges and knockout. Obviously, we're sitting in the UU development, and that's a great part of the constituency, and that's a great development. But yet, the glider we've been talking about forever. Getting public transport in North Belfast is not great. Housing isn't great in North Belfast. There are rising education pressures. Nuala, your in-tray must be stacked. So why is it that in North Belfast we seem to have these chronic things of it either takes years to get something done, like the glider, which is a bus with no tickets, which would be positive to get, and we've got all these other issues and all these other pressures.
As you always see you at the bus stop, and I'm going the opposite direction as well. Like, if it was going in the right direction, I'd offer a lift. I would offer a lift. But I will say is that those issues, aside from the glider, we're seeing them all over Northern Ireland. You know, housing undoubtedly is the biggest caseload in my office that we deal with, and it's really, really disheartening when everything that you do is you can ensure that everyone has the right points that you do. You literally have to frog march at times, the housing executive and maintenance team, to actually fix issues. And I know that you'll get it in your office too. You have to just, I don't think the housing executive like us. But we're not there to be their friends, to be perfectly honest. But, you know, to be fair, the issues that we're dealing with, we have issues as well with special educational needs. We have children that are statemented and they are not getting the right support one-to-one in their classrooms. And then we also have teachers that are contacting too with lots of issues. And then another thing is we try to deal with the Department of Infrastructure. It's sometimes like you'd be better banging your head off the wall because an idea might fall out for them. Honestly, it can be very, very difficult. But all that at the minute is going on because there's a political vacuum at Stormont. You know, we haven't had a budget that has been actually implemented by ministers in an executive so that we can actually give direction, because at the end of the day there needs to be a priority of issues that needs to be fixed. Instead, we are now leaving it up to civil servants to make decisions of which they, to be quite frank, should not be making, and whether that a politician likes the decision or likes that reason or likes that or not, they have to make decisions on where the money needs to go. And until we have an assembly executive, now that's not saying that an executive will fix all issues like that, it won't. But without the one, it's just much worse. It's not actually addressing the issues that need to be fixed. And then couple that with a government in Westminster that has just been reducing the spend on Northern Ireland, reducing the fact that we're not able to actually spend our block grant because of their cuts in England, Wales. It's just a disaster that has been boiling over the last number of years. We would get back into Stormont tomorrow. Alliance have said that time again, we will not hold the entirety of the population to ransom. We will get in there and we will make decisions, because it's been far too long that we've had that. It was 3 years and then we were in the January and then COVID happened. And all of the decisions that should have been taking place were being put on the back burner. And now is just not the time for people in Northern Ireland yet again. Because remember, when you look at other parts of the UK and the island of Ireland, that they didn't have the same issues that we have here. For over 30, 40 years, we were just making our issues through, whether it was through Westminster or whether it was in Northern Ireland, but they were addressing tiny, tiny areas, because of the conflict, because there was other priorities that obviously were being dealt with then. So we had a lot of catching up to do, but it's more or less stalled over the last 5 or 6 years.
Okay, and Phillip, same question to you. What I mean, rising issues seems to take a long time. I mean, you know, it's right. These are issues in other constituencies as well, but you know, we've been talking about things like the glider, even getting big developments done. They seem to take a while. What is the hold up?
Listen, the bendy bus isn't going to transform North Belfast, but it is symptomatic of the issues that we do have, and when it is finally here, it needs to come to Glengormley and not stop halfway up the Antrim Road. But listen, we have positives to look at. So as you say, right here in the heart of North Belfast, Belfast Telegraph building with future developments there. Belfast City Council have purchased the former bank on the corner of North Street, and that will be a landmark visitor centre for Belfast. But the basic issues we get wrong, and that even though we've built this university, and Duncan somewhere about here, you know, you can't walk in a straight line from the Shore Road to here without crossing 11 different junctions, running across a 4-lane motorway, and take your life in your hands. We don't have enough connected thinking. You know, we in Northern Ireland love to operate in isolation, and one department will do one thing and another department will do one, where in fact if we actually all worked together and had a proper master plan that we were all stakeholders were bought into, we could actually connect up these developments, because we continuously build things that divide and break up parts of North Belfast rather than try to interconnect them. So for me, what I would like to see is actually the communities on the doorsteps of this university and other gateways into the city are actually able to access them and connect into them, because currently they can't. As you said, David, earlier, and I referenced housing is the biggest issue that I have in North Belfast. Thankfully, we have a great housing association, Grove Housing, and wave to their chief executive in the front row. But no, it is the biggest issue that I face. We have 47% of our cases, last time I checked, are housing related. So yes, that's about social housing, but it's also about affordable housing for our young people too. We need that mix because we want young people to be able to stay in North Belfast, and currently they can't afford to buy a house. When houses go up for sale, they just go to a huge price. Trying to get 10% mortgage higher, they just can't do that. And it's about getting that mixed tenure and that ambition that we want young people to be able to also, keep their families in North Belfast, and they're not having to go out to the suburbs of Outer Newton Abbey or other parts of the city to be able to buy a house that suits their needs. So it's about trying to get that mixed tenure of development, that community aspect that Alison spoke about, that we're not just throwing up hundreds of houses, but there's skill provision there, there's GPs, there's doctors, where everyone can actually have a healthy and successful community.
Alison, your thoughts on just obviously public service provision and just in terms of it seems to take an age in Northern. Someone said to me, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine the other day, who again was struggling to buy a house in North Belfast, and he just said to me, "Is it just me, or does it seem like nothing is working at the minute? You can't do a numerous amount of things."
I mean, it was like that before as well. I know it's worse now. Obviously, there's no assembly, but I mean, it's not like we lived in some utopia beforehand. Yeah. Everything was great. It's consultations by consultations. Everything takes so long, and then COVID happened, and then all of a sudden, all the things that they told us they couldn't do really quickly, and I'm like, well, there you go. There's a template, so you can just get money out to people when they need it. So you can just move things around when you need to. And you'd like to have thought that would have continued on, but no, the minute that went down, the shutters came down again and everything's back to, we need to have 16 consultations before we can give you that. And it's the planning issue as well, I think, needs centralised, it needs taken control of. And also, I mean, what you don't want to do then is allow your plan to become like Dublin, this allowing like huge property speculators to come in and buy up large numbers of properties. It should just be illegal, it just shouldn't be allowed. Mm-hmm. Look what they've done to the South by allowing that to happen. It's just a disaster. So, and housing and also youth provision, it really upsets me as well because, I'm someone from a very sort of working class at the time, very socially deprived community, and then I go into places and I think, you've left those children behind, you just forgot about them. Nobody cares. Children, like you'd mentioned when you asked me to do this, I did a feature in the New Lodge where I went down and spoke to the young people, and literally went down and sat on the edge of a pavement and spoke to them, and it was at the start they were very because they just don't like the press, they don't like anyone. Every adult they've ever met has just been awful to them. And eventually I laughed because this wee girl who was about 3.5 foot tall, she stepped out and went, I'll speak to her, and then that was it. But when you spoke to them, like a load of them didn't have a mother because their mothers had either taken their own lives or died from drug overdoses. All of them were grannies and aunts and living all over the place, and they just felt abandoned. And they went, no. And one of them actually said, we did like a clean up and cleaned the whole area and washed all the graffiti, and no one even thanked us. They just say bad things about us. I'm thinking, like, you're just abandoning those children, and that's not the peace process that I wanted or voted for, that I was sold. If you're leaving behind full estates full of teenagers to the mercy of the world without trying to bring them along with you, well then you've failed completely. You've failed in all aspects of politics from the top down. Yeah,
and that is us bang on time. Could you just please give a big round of applause to Nuala McAllister, Phillip Brett and Allison Morris for coming along today and asking questions. And again, as Phillip and Nuala and Alison were saying, you guys really are the best of North Belfast. That's all we have time for this edition of Slugger TV. Thank you very much for watching. We'll be back next month from the Imagine Festival, looking at people departing from politics. In the meantime, you can keep up to date with everything else on sluggerotool.com. Thank you for watching.